Well, ladies and gentlemen, the 2005 AFL Grand Final is remembered for being a classic meeting between the Sydney Swans and the West Coast Eagles. Of course, who could forget that classic ending with the Leo Barry mark and the commentary from Stephen Quartermain at the time. But this Grand Final could have been remembered for a completely different and tragic reason if it wasn't for police and ASIO raids just 2 months before the Grand Final. Abdul Nasser Ben Brika was born in Algeria in 1960 and emigrated to Australia in 1989, where he settled in Melbourne's northern suburbs. He overstayed his tourist visa in 1990 and spent the next 6 years fighting the immigration system to stay in the country. In 1996, he was granted residence after marrying a woman from Lebanon after arguing for his right to stay in Australia, mentioning his, quote, love of the Australian lifestyle. He did become an Australian citizen in the year 1998, and in the following years he did become more radical after the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq by US and Australian forces. He did tell the ABC, quote, Osama bin Laden is a great man, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York City. And it was through 2004 and 2005 where things started to get serious, with ASIO and police receiving intel that terrorists in Melbourne and Sydney were planning to attack a number of sites, including the 2005 AFL Grand Final. This article from The Age, Ben Brika, quote, will damage buildings, last things. He then said, has to be proper because it is very difficult to get them. I mean, especially the product. After 11th of September, it's not easy. These conversations were allegedly held on March 4, 2005. And in around July 2005, the Secret Service and police conducted raids on the terrorist cell, and this forced the terrorists to put the plans to attack the Grand Final on hold, and they pivoted and said the next targets were going to be the NAB Cup, which was the pre-season competition in the AFL at the time, and the Crown Casino building at the Grand Prix weekend in early 2006. But fortunately, Ben Brika and the other terrorists in the cell were arrested before they could put these plans into action in November of 2005. And Ben Brika was convicted and jailed for 15 years for this scheme. After serving his sentence, he was kept in prison for another few years following an order from the Department of Home Affairs, where he was released after a recommendation from the Albanese government, and a condition of his release was that he was ordered to attend psychiatric and de-radicalisation sessions. He was also banned for life from the MCG after his release. And thankfully the Grand Final attack was prevented, but it is interesting to consider what would have happened if the attack did go through in a football sense. There was 91,000 in attendance that day. The latest round of the MCG redevelopment for the 2006 Commonwealth Games was not quite complete at that point, so the attendance wasn't as high as it is now at around 100k. Obviously, people's safety is a lot more important than football, but it is interesting what the implications for the AFL would have been if this happened. And presumably the plan would have been to attack the MCG during the game or just before the game for maximum damage, where you are going to have the most amount of people in the ground. And I believe the plot was for a terrorist suicide bombing to occur. Now, we know in open air environments, typically you do get more damage done by shooting rather than bombing. And you would have seen that with the attacks in Paris in 2015, because what you do get in a bombing situation in an open air environment is the people directly around the attacker absorb most of that shrapnel and damage and sort of act as a cushion for the people who are a little bit further away from the bomber. But obviously with bombing, there is the potential for the stadium itself to sustain some damage. So it would have been interesting whether that was structural damage or just a relatively easy fix in terms of that. And obviously the game would have been called off if the attack did occur before or during the game. And the AFL rules say that if a game is abandoned midway through the first half, it is either replayed or considered a draw. And if it's abandoned in the second half, the team that is winning at that point in time is declared the winner. Now, I think obviously with a grand final, you can't have a draw. And even if the attack did occur during the second half, I'm not sure how the public and the winning team would feel about being declared a winner midway through the third quarter, for example. So I think the game would likely be replayed at a later date. And in terms of the location, it would probably depend on the damage that the MCG did sustain. If they had to do some repairs on it where the structural integrity of the ground was at risk. Obviously, they wouldn't be playing there directly afterwards. So I think the game may have been replayed either at Stadium Australia, which was called, I believe, Telstra Stadium at the time. That is the Olympic Stadium in Sydney, because it has the highest capacity outside of the MCG at around 80k. Or potentially they want to keep it at Marvel Stadium, which was called the Telstra Dome at the time, to keep the game in Melbourne. You did have a Perth and Sydney team playing at that point in time, so potentially you do want to retain that occurring on a neutral site. If the MCG wasn't damaged, I think they probably play the game back at the MCG, maybe the next weekend. I think possibly it would be played behind closed doors for public safety, because following a terrorist attack, obviously people are going to be concerned about going back to the scene of the crime and even leaving the house in general, of course. And there would have been a weird vibe. The football wouldn't have felt important after such a tragedy. And really, I don't think the public would have really cared either way about the result of the game after something so horrible had just occurred. So thankfully, we never had to deal with this. And hopefully we never have to deal with anything like this in the future, because it is just a horrible thought. People go to the football to enjoy themselves and enjoy the game, not put their lives at risk. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.